What if Sylvie's junk food obsession is the solution, not the problem? When women talk about weight regain, they usually start with the food. They will tell me about what they're eating that they shouldn't and all the ways they've tried to stop. Yet the more closely you examine eating behaviour, the more obvious it becomes that food is often the solution to the problem, not the reverse. Like many, Sylvie's food story sounds familiar, with a long history of dieting, eating junk food, and promising to do better tomorrow. But underneath the junk food sits a food story that began decades earlier at the family dinner table. And once that story becomes visible, craving junk food makes perfect sense. Listen in. Hi there, it's Bronwyn. Welcome back to Before Dieting. Last week, I introduced a new model and terminology to understand eating behaviour. In that episode, I just mentioned rules and stories, eating blueprints and eating systems. And today, I want to slow the pace down a bit and spend some time inside the first two layers of that model. Because food stories are often where eating begins to make sense. So just to clarify, food rules describe what someone does, while food stories help explain why. Now, that difference may sound small, but it can change your entire understanding of why you eat the way you do. If you think about someone who can't leave food on their plate, at the level of food rule, the behaviour is easy to describe. They finish a meal, whether they're full or not. And in fact, they might even finish the leftovers on someone else's plate. But while the rule tells you what happens, it doesn't tell you where it came from. And the moment you begin asking how that rule formed, a different conversation begins. And let me tell you, from my experience, that conversation can cover a lot of ground. In my conversations with women, many of the food stories involved food scarcity, either in the woman's own childhood or in the experiences of a parent or grandparent. Others had the same rule, but it emerged from family expectations around obedience, where children were expected to do as they were told without question. And sometimes eating everything on your plate was tied to family relationships where eating was a way of expressing love or appreciation or connection. So any one of these, and possibly many others, can sit underneath the eating behaviour that you eat everything that's on the plate. So the rule might be common across many women. Everybody finishes the food on their plate, but what changes is the explanation. And we need to remember that that explanation is unique to the individual. Most attempts to change eating focus on food rules. Eat less, stop snacking, avoid sugar, stop eating when you're satisfied. And on the surface, those rules sound perfectly reasonable. The problem is that the new rules are often being layered over long-standing ones. Rules that have been reinforced for years and connected to important experiences and relationships. And as a result, women find themselves saying, well, I'm going to eat this way, I'm going to eat healthy, only to end up eating exactly in the way they were trying not to. Because if the behaviour is connected to something deeper, changing the rule doesn't necessarily change the story. And many women know exactly what they want to eat and how they want to eat, but they don't understand why it feels so difficult to do it. And this is where identifying food rules and uncovering the stories attached to them starts to reveal a much bigger picture. Food stories expose the history and emotional logic that sits beneath eating behaviour. They explain why certain patterns persist and why some rules feel almost impossible to break. Sylvie's story is a good example. On the surface, it looks like a story about junk food, but underneath sits something older, and once that story becomes visible, the eating begins to look very different. So a little bit of background about Sylvie. She's in her late 40s, and she describes herself as a fit but big woman. And like many, she spent years moving between weight loss attempts, trying to understand why the same patterns kept returning. And her biggest frustration is junk food. As she said, I'm always thinking about eating sweet snacks when I'm by myself. She works as a customer service area representative, and so that involves driving from site to site throughout the week. So her car's become both a mobile office and a mobile dining room. Most mornings follow the same rhythm. As she starts early, she usually skips breakfast, but on the way to the first customer site, she stops and buys a coffee, picks up a sandwich for lunch, and then starts adding junk food for her eating on the go. By the end of the day, wrappers cover the floor of the car, everything gets cleaned up, promises are made that tomorrow will be different, and then the pattern repeats. For a long time, Sylvie explained this as poor choices and weak willpower. And that explanation held together until she began looking more closely at it. As she explored her history back to when she recalled developing her love of sweet junk food, a different picture emerged. When she was growing up, evening meals were tense. Her older sister regularly argued with her father at the dinner table. Sylvie said, as soon as it started, I'd get a knot in my stomach, I'd go quiet, eat fast, and just try to get over with it. You might already guess the types of food rules that were forming for Sylvie. One was get through dinner quickly, so eat fast, stay out of conflict, and possibly avoid drawing attention to yourself. Now, nobody taught her those rules directly. They developed because they helped her navigate an environment that felt unpredictable. So the rule wasn't really about food. Food was simply where the rule became visible. The deeper instruction was about safety and self-protection. And many food rules work this way. They appear to be about eating, but their original purpose was solving an entirely different problem. That's one reason why eating can feel so confusing. The visible behaviour and the original purpose are often separated by decades. For Sylvie, later, after everyone had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Sylvie would sneak into the pantry. She said, Mum kept a big Tupperware container filled with chocolate lollies and candy bars, and I'd eat them until the knot in my stomach disappeared. So this is where her food story is becoming visible. The most important thing isn't the chocolate, it's the knot. The knot appeared in her stomach first. The junk food came later. So the stomach knot created the craving, and the sweet things provided the relief. For years, Sylvie knew the volume of junk food she was eating was the biggest contributor to her weight gain. So she did what any intelligent woman would do. She stopped eating it. Stopping for a day or two was manageable, but inevitably the old pattern roared back. And it makes sense to go to the obvious place, and that is the chocolate and the sweet things. But we do need to realise that's not the beginning of the problem. For Sylvie, each evening when family conflict arrived, the knot in her stomach also appeared. And every evening she needed relief from that, and the sweet treats were the solution that was available. That's a really important distinction to make, because if the knot is the beginning of the sequence, removing the chocolate doesn't automatically remove the problem. The tension still exists along with the relief that's needed. And this is another area where women get trapped. They try to eliminate the solution without investigating the problem that solution was solving. When the discomfort remains, the search for relief simply finds another pathway. The more Sylvie worked through her history, she noticed something she'd never connected before. Her current job recreated many of the same conditions at that childhood dinner table. Her workday involved complaints, problems, difficult conversations, and dissatisfied customers. She said every night growing up, dinner would start with an argument. Now, every day, I'm moving from one difficult situation to another. And once she saw that connection, she couldn't unsee it. She went on to say, I realised my workday had become another version of those childhood dinners. What struck her wasn't the junk food, it was the familiarity of the feeling. It was a different environment with different people, but the knot in her stomach was the same. Until that moment, work stress and childhood dinners had existed as separate categories in her mind. One belonged in the past and the other belonged in the present. But seeing them side by side revealed a connection she'd never considered. The situation had changed, the emotional experience had not. And once she could see that, the eating began to make a different kind of sense. That's the value of a food story. Food rules describe what happens, food stories explain why. And without that backstory, overeating junk food can look illogical. But with the story, her eating becomes much more understandable. As Sylvie continued working through her history, she developed a broader understanding of her eating. She realised she eats when she's bored, agitated, stressed, angry, overworked. She said the cure for any or all of these has been eating sweet things. Now that explanation sounds very different from saying she lacks willpower. One closes inquiry and the other one opens it up. So Sylvie believes she will eventually change jobs, but she's resisting the urge to make that decision at this time. She wanted to understand the pattern more fully And to do that, she needed to sit with the realizations for a little longer. She said, otherwise I could easily pick another job that ends up having the same problems as this one, which is a great observation because she knows that changing the environment doesn't automatically change the pattern. And without understanding what's being recreated, it's easy to build the same experience in a different location. And this is where we'll pick up next week because the food story is only one part of the explanation. Sylvie wasn't responding to a single childhood memory. Over time, those experiences organised themselves into a larger pattern that shaped how she managed conflict and responded to pressure. In the Waiting for Happiness project, we call that larger pattern an eating blueprint. Next week, I'll show you how eating blueprints form and why they continue operating long after childhood has ended. We'll also look at how understanding them opens possibilities that go far beyond calories, restriction, and trying harder. Until then, I want you to have a think about your own eating, not the food itself, but the story behind it. And to recap, food rules describe what happens, food stories explain why. And sometimes when you understand that story, everything changes. Now, if you'd like a copy of the model and definitions for these 4 layers, you can download it using the link in the show notes. It's a useful reference for understanding where food rules and food stories fit within the broader structure of eating behaviour. Thanks for listening to Before Dieting, and if you found today's episode helpful, I'd appreciate a rating or a review. And if you do know someone who might recognise themselves in Sylvie's story, please share the episode with them. Take care, and I'll talk with you next week.